Attraction rarely begins where most people believe it does. It does not originate in clever phrases, flawless timing, or outward perfection. It begins beneath awareness, in the quiet, symbolic language of the unconscious, where images form before thoughts and emotions anchor themselves long before logic intervenes. Carl Jung understood this terrain intimately. He observed that human beings do not fall in love with people as they are, but with what those people awaken within them. Attraction is not a reaction to appearance or words alone. It is a response to meaning. And meaning is born where emotion and imagination meet. Modern connection often ignores this truth. Conversations open with politeness and efficiency, shaped by habit rather than presence. Neutral questions glide across the surface, exchanged out of courtesy, not curiosity. These interactions leave no trace because they stir nothing beneath the surface. The psyche records what moves it, not what merely passes through. Without emotion, there is no imprint. Without an image, there is no memory. Jung made this clear when he wrote that the unconscious directs life when it remains unacknowledged, shaping destiny from the shadows. In the realm of attraction, this means that most encounters fail not from lack of effort, but from lack of symbolic depth. Female empowerment begins precisely here. At the moment, a woman understands that her power does not come from chasing approval or performing desirability. It comes from sovereignty over her inner world. The unconscious responds not to need, but to presence, not to perfection, but to authenticity. When a woman speaks from a place of inner alignment, her words carry weight beyond their surface meaning. They become symbols rather than statements, invitations rather than requests. This is not manipulation. It is coherence between inner certainty and outer expression. Jung's concept of projection illuminates why this works. People project their unlived desires, unmet longings, and hidden aspirations onto others, especially in moments of emotional openness. A single phrase, when spoken with grounded confidence, can activate this projection. It does not force desire. It provides a canvas upon which the other psyche begins to paint. What lingers afterward is not the sentence itself, but the feeling it stirred, the image it awakened, the possibility it suggested. This is why subtlety outperforms intensity. The unconscious resists pressure, but responds to suggestion. Many women are conditioned to believe that attraction requires effortful performance. Say the right thing. Be endlessly pleasant. Offer reassurance. Avoid discomfort. Yet, Jungian psychology reveals the opposite dynamic at play. The masculine unconscious, like all unconscious structures, is drawn toward polarity, mystery, and emotional resonance. It responds to symbols that imply connection without demanding it, confidence without dominance, desire without urgency. Emotional sovereignty becomes magnetic because it signals wholeness rather than need. At the heart of this dynamic lies a simple truth. The psyche is relational. Human beings long to feel chosen, seen, included in a shared meaning. Language that implies partnership activates an archetypal structure older than romance itself. It echoes the primordial desire for alliance, for walking alongside another rather than standing apart. When this implication arises naturally within a moment of connection, it bypasses rational defenses and settles quietly into the unconscious. From there, it works on its own time. This is where individuation enters the story. Jung described individuation as the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating conscious identity with unconscious depth. In relationships, individuation requires relinquishing the urge to be validated and embracing the courage to be authentic. A woman who speaks from this place is no longer negotiating her worth. She is expressing it. Her words no longer ask for permission to exist in someone else's world. They assume belonging without entitlement. That assumption alone reshapes the relational field. The shadow, too, plays its role. The fear of rejection, the anxiety of being seen, the impulse to overcompensate through intensity all belong to the shadow side of desire. When unexamined, these forces sabotage connection. When acknowledged, they lose their grip. Emotional maturity is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate expression. Calm confidence becomes possible only when the shadow is no longer denied but integrated. This understanding reframes attraction entirely. It is no longer a strategy to win someone over, but a practice of presence. Words become extensions of inner clarity rather than tools of persuasion. Connection becomes a shared field rather than a conquest. In this space, a woman does not shrink herself to be chosen, nor does she inflate herself to be noticed. She stands rooted in self-recognition, allowing others to meet her there or not at all. The premise is simple yet profound. What is spoken from wholeness reaches wholeness in another. What is spoken from lack awakens lack in return. This is not mysticism, it is psychological resonance, and it is here, in this subtle terrain, that a few well-placed words can carry extraordinary power, not because of their structure, but because of the consciousness behind them. Once the unconscious has been stirred, it does not ask for repetition, it listens for congruence. This is where many attempts at connection quietly collapse. Words may be spoken correctly, but the inner posture contradicts them. The psyche perceives this discrepancy instantly. Jung believed that what is not consciously aligned manifests unconsciously, often undermining intentions despite best efforts. Attraction falters not because the invitation was wrong, but because the inner state behind it was fragmented. Emotional resonance requires coherence between body, voice, and inner conviction. When language implies closeness but the body retreats, the unconscious reads uncertainty. When tone suggests desire but posture signals hesitation, the message dissolves. The unconscious does not interpret language literally. It interprets energy, rhythm, and emotional consistency. This is why presence outweighs performance. A woman grounded in herself does not rush to fill silence, does not monitor reactions anxiously, does not chase affirmation through excess expression. Her stillness becomes part of the message. Jung often emphasized that the body speaks the psyche's truth before the mind can censor it. This is especially true in moments of emerging attraction. Eye contact held just a moment longer than necessary, a relaxed stance that occupies space without tension. A voice that does not hurry to justify itself. These elements communicate self-trust. They signal that connection is welcome but not required for self-worth. This paradox is precisely what generates intrigue. Desire intensifies in the presence of freedom, not pressure. Female empowerment, within this framework, is not about dominance or control. It is about self-possession. A woman who owns her inner world does not outsource her value to another's response. She understands that attraction is a meeting, not a negotiation. This understanding shifts the emotional dynamic instantly. The other person is no longer positioned as judge or prize, but as participant. The unconscious relaxes when it senses equality rather than pursuit. Timing also carries symbolic weight. Words offered too early collapse into intrusion. Words offered too late fade into missed opportunity. Jung's concept of synchronicity illuminates this delicate balance. Meaningful moments arise when inner readiness aligns with outer circumstance. In conversation, this appears as flow, a sense that words emerge naturally rather than being inserted. When language feels inevitable rather than rehearsed, it carries authenticity. The unconscious recognizes this as truth rather than tactic. The temptation to overuse emotionally charged phrases stems from insecurity, not confidence. Repetition attempts to force certainty where none yet exists, but mystery thrives in restraint. The unconscious continues working only when left space to do so. When a phrase is offered once and then released, it becomes an echo rather than a demand. The mind returns to it later, replaying the moment, exploring its implications. This delayed effect is often mistaken for indifference, but it is actually integration. One of the most subtle errors occurs when attention turns inward immediately after speaking, scanning for reaction, bracing for outcome. This internal collapse is perceptible. It shifts energy from invitation to expectation. Jung warned that when the ego fixates on results, it disrupts the natural movement of psychic processes. Attraction, like meaning, cannot be forced without being distorted. Letting go is not passive. It is an act of trust in one's own sufficiency. The shadow resurfaces here as well. Fear of invisibility drives overexpression. Fear of rejection drives apology disguised as charm. Fear of desire drives intensity masquerading as confidence. When these shadows remain unconscious, they leak into tone and behavior. When acknowledged, they lose their urgency. A woman who has faced her fear of not being chosen no longer needs to perform certainty. Her calm becomes credible because it is earned, not assumed. What unfolds next is subtle but profound. The other person begins to experience a shift in perception, not because they were convinced, but because they were included in a possibility rather than pressured into a decision. The unconscious responds to inclusion as safety. Safety allows curiosity. Curiosity allows desire. This progression cannot be rushed without collapsing the very structure that sustains it. The phrase itself is not the power. The power lies in the archetype it activates. Partnership, alliance, shared movement. This archetype exists far beyond romance. It is the same psychological structure that strengthens teams, deepens friendships, and repairs fractured dialogue. When language invites rather than instructs, it restores dignity to both parties. It communicates trust without dependency. As this understanding deepens, communication transforms. Conversations become less about filling space and more about creating it. Silence gains value. Presence replaces performance. The empowered woman no longer wonders how she is being perceived. She remains anchored in how she is being expressed. This shift marks a turning point in individuation, where external validation loses its authority over internal alignment. The unconscious does not forget what made it feel alive. It does not forget moments of ease, clarity, and inclusion. These moments settle quietly, resurfacing later as interest, memory, or desire without obvious cause. This is the enduring nature of symbolic communication. It works beneath awareness, shaping orientation rather than demanding response. And so, the invitation lingers not as a sentence remembered, but as a feeling that refuses to dissolve. As the unconscious continues its quiet work, something essential shifts in the inner life of the woman who speaks from alignment. She is no longer performing connection, she is embodying it. This distinction is subtle yet transformative. Jung believed that what is lived unconsciously repeats as fate, while what is brought into consciousness becomes choice. When a woman understands how symbolic language operates within herself first, she steps out of reactive patterns and into authorship of her relational experience. This authorship is not control over others, but responsibility for one's own psychic state. The empowered woman recognizes that attraction does not arise from convincing another of her value, but from recognizing it within herself. This recognition alters posture, pace, and presence. It slows the impulse to fill silence, to over-explain, to soften desire into politeness. Instead, expression becomes clean, unburdened by expectation. What is offered is simply what is true in the moment. Jung's notion of the anima and animus provides further depth here. Every man carries an inner feminine image, just as every woman carries an inner masculine image. These inner figures shape attraction far more than conscious preferences. When a woman speaks with clarity and grounded confidence, she activates the animus within herself and resonates with the anima within the man. This resonance feels familiar, even intimate, without requiring intimacy itself. It creates a sense of recognition that precedes logic. This is why attempts to impress often fail. They appeal to the ego, not the unconscious. The ego evaluates, compares, and defends. The unconscious imagines, feels, and responds symbolically. When language bypasses evaluation and speaks directly to imagination, it awakens desire without effort. The other person may not articulate why they feel drawn in, only that something shifted. Jung would describe this as an encounter with an archetype rather than an individual trait. At this stage, restraint becomes an act of self-respect. Not every impulse requires expression, not every spark requires pursuit. The woman who understands this does not cling to moments of connection as proof of worth. She allows them to exist, to breathe, to unfold or fade without internal collapse. This emotional sovereignty is felt immediately. It signals maturity, depth, and self-trust. These qualities cannot be imitated convincingly. They emerge from inner work. The body, again, plays its silent role. Relaxation replaces vigilance. Movement becomes fluid rather than guarded. The nervous system settles when there's no internal negotiation for approval. This calm is not indifference. It is openness without desperation. The unconscious reads this as safety, and safety is the prerequisite for desire. Where there is pressure, the psyche contracts. Where there is space, it expands. Language, when aligned with this state, becomes an extension of presence rather than a strategy. A phrase suggesting togetherness no longer feels risky because it does not carry the burden of outcome. It is an offering, not a wager. If received, it opens a path. If not, it dissolves without injury to identity. This resilience marks the difference between seeking connection and being available for it. Jung warned against inflation, the ego's temptation to identify with archetypal power. This caution applies here as well. The use of symbolic language is not about superiority or manipulation. When inflated, it becomes hollow, even predatory. Authentic power remains quiet. It does not need to prove itself. It rests in the knowledge that connection cannot be forced without becoming distorted. As this awareness integrates, relationships of all kinds begin to shift. Conversations deepen without effort. Others respond with greater openness, sensing they are not being managed or evaluated. The atmosphere becomes collaborative rather than transactional. This is the relational field Jung believed was essential for psychological growth. Individuation does not occur in isolation. It unfolds through encounters that reflect the self back in new ways. The most profound change, however, occurs internally. The woman who once measured her impact through reactions now measures it through integrity. She feels the difference between speaking from fullness and speaking from lack. She notices when desire is clean and when it is contaminated by fear. This discernment becomes intuitive over time, guiding expression without conscious calculation. Attraction, then, becomes a byproduct rather than a goal. It arises naturally when inner alignment meets relational opportunity. It fades naturally when alignment is absent. There is no drama in either outcome. This emotional neutrality is not coldness, it is freedom. Freedom from the compulsion to be chosen, freedom to choose oneself first. Jung believed that psychological growth leads inevitably toward greater responsibility for one's inner life. In this responsibility lies true empowerment, when a woman no longer hands her sense of worth to the unpredictable responses of others. Her presence stabilizes. Her words gain gravity because they are no longer bargaining chips. They are expressions of truth, offered without attachment. And it is precisely this unattached authenticity that leaves the deepest mark. Not because it demands remembrance, but because it cannot be ignored by the unconscious once encountered. As this understanding settles, attraction is no longer viewed as something to be engineered, but as something that reveals itself when inner alignment meets relational readiness. The unconscious responds not to effort, but to coherence. Jung described this as the psyche's preference for wholeness. When words, body, and intention move in the same direction, they create a signal that is felt rather than analyzed. This signal carries authority without force, intimacy without invasion. What emerges here is a deeper form of confidence, one that does not rely on dominance or withdrawal. It is the confidence of self-containment. The empowered woman does not oscillate between pursuit and retreat. She remains present, attentive, and grounded, allowing connection to approach her rather than chasing it. This orientation reverses the familiar dynamic of attraction, placing choice back into her hands without making it a weapon. Jung's work on the self, the central organizing principle of the psyche, becomes particularly relevant. When the ego aligns with the self, behavior feels natural rather than strategic. Communication loses its sharp edges. There is no longer a need to impress, provoke, or test. Words arise from an inner stillness that trusts its own legitimacy. This trust is sensed immediately by others, even if they cannot articulate why. In this state, silence becomes as expressive as speech. Pauses are no longer filled with anxiety. They become spaces where meaning gathers. The unconscious thrives in these spaces. It completes what is left unfinished, imagines what is merely suggested. This is why subtle implication often carries more power than explicit declaration. The psyche prefers participation over instruction. The cultural narrative surrounding romance often encourages urgency. Act quickly, secure interest, avoid ambiguity. Yet, ambiguity, when grounded in self-assurance, is not confusion. It is openness. It allows desire to unfold without being cornered. Jung warned that forcing psychic processes leads to neurosis. In relationships, this appears as tension, resistance, or sudden withdrawal. Allowing processes to move at their own pace preserves vitality. As this approach extends beyond romance, its universality becomes clear. The same symbolic language that invites attraction also fosters collaboration, trust, and mutual respect. When someone is addressed as a partner rather than an obstacle or audience, defenses soften. A sense of shared purpose emerges. This is not manipulation. It is recognition of a fundamental human need to belong without being absorbed. Female empowerment, in this context, transcends interpersonal outcomes. It becomes an internal orientation toward life. The woman who speaks from self-possession carries herself differently in every arena. She no longer minimizes her presence to avoid discomfort, nor exaggerates it to secure attention. She occupies space with quiet legitimacy. This legitimacy cannot be revoked by another's response. The shadow, once again, demands acknowledgement. Old patterns may resurface in moments of vulnerability. The urge to over-explain, to seek reassurance, to retreat into silence when uncertainty arises. These impulses do not signify failure. They are invitations to deeper integration. Jung believed that the shadow is not eliminated, but transformed through conscious relationship. Each moment of awareness weakens its grip. Over time, the nervous system adapts to this new mode of relating. Calm replaces vigilance. Curiosity replaces anxiety. Connection becomes something that can be enjoyed without being clung to. This emotional flexibility is a sign of psychological maturity. It allows relationships to evolve organically rather than being steered by fear of loss. The woman who embodies this state becomes memorable not because she demands attention, but because she offers presence. Others feel seen rather than evaluated, invited rather than pursued. This experience stands out in a world saturated with performance and pretense. It leaves an impression precisely because it asks for nothing in return. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Transformation, however, requires openness. It cannot occur where control dominates. By relinquishing the need to manage outcomes, the empowered woman allows genuine reaction to occur. Whatever emerges is real and therefore meaningful. This approach does not guarantee specific outcomes. It guarantees integrity. Some connections will deepen, others will dissolve. Both are valid expressions of alignment. The measure of success is no longer external validation, but internal coherence. This coherence becomes its own reward, shaping not only relationships, but the entire orientation towards self and others. And so, Attraction becomes less about being unforgettable to another and more about being irreducible to oneself. From this place, whatever connections arise, do so in truth, carrying the potential to transform both parties not through force, but through resonance. At the deepest level, what has been unfolding is not a lesson in attraction, but an invitation into psychological maturity. Jung understood that growth occurs when a person stops seeking completion outside themselves and begins relating from inner fullness. When this shift happens, relationships are no longer arenas for validation, but mirrors that reflect one's state of being. What is offered to others is no longer a request to be chosen, but an extension of presence that invites mutual recognition. The phrase that began this exploration was never meant to stand alone. It functions only as a vessel, carrying the quality of consciousness behind it. Without that consciousness, it is empty. With it, the phrase becomes symbolic language, speaking directly to the unconscious where real connection takes root. This is the realm Jung believed held the power to transform lives not through force or persuasion, but through meaning. Meaning, in Jungian terms, arises when experience aligns with inner truth. A woman who has done this inner work no longer fears being misunderstood. Because she is no longer misunderstanding herself, she no longer clings to outcomes, because her worth is not negotiated in moments of connection. She allows relationships to reveal themselves as they are, trusting that what resonates will stay and what does not will fall away without diminishing her. This is individuation in motion. The ego relinquishes its hunger for control and aligns with the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche. From this alignment comes a natural authority, not authority over others, but authority over one's own emotional life. This authority is felt immediately in tone, timing, and restraint. It cannot be faked, only cultivated. The unconscious responds to this cultivation with clarity. Confusion fades, patterns repeat less, encounters become cleaner, more honest. Even endings lose their sting when they are understood as part of psychological truth rather than personal failure. Jung emphasized that wholeness requires the courage to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into fear. This tolerance becomes the foundation of emotional freedom. Attraction, then, is redefined. It is no longer a prize to be won, but a signal of resonance. When resonance exists, connection flows. When it does not, no amount of effort can manufacture it without cost. Recognizing this saves enormous energy. It redirects attention inward, where real power has always lived. The most transformative realization is this: being unforgettable to another is never as important as being faithful to oneself. When self-betrayal ends, presence deepens. When presence deepens, language simplifies. Words no longer attempt to secure a future. They acknowledge the present, and it is the present moment, Jung believed, that holds the seed of transformation. This way of relating ripples outward. Friendships grow more honest. Professional interactions gain mutual respect. Family dynamics soften when control is replaced by clarity. The same symbolic language that invites attraction also restores dignity across relationships. It reminds others that they are being met as equals, not managed as outcomes. The unconscious remembers how it felt to be included without being consumed, invited without being pressured. These moments become reference points, shaping future choices and perceptions. This is how one leaves a mark without trying to, not by demanding remembrance, but by offering an experience of wholeness. In the end, the lesson returns to Jung's central insight. What remains unconscious will continue to shape life as fate. What is brought into awareness becomes choice. When a woman chooses to speak from alignment rather than fear, from sovereignty rather than need, she changes not only how others respond to her, but how she inhabits her own life. Connection becomes an expression of self-knowledge rather than self-doubt. Desire becomes clean rather than urgent. Presence becomes the message. And from this place, whatever unfolds does so with meaning. If this reflection resonated, take a moment to like and share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for more explorations into psychology, self-worth, and conscious connection, and leave a comment below about a moment when words changed the way you felt seen.